On November 13, 1982, Duck Koo Kim fought Ray Mancini for the WBA lightweight title in Las Vegas. In the 14th round, Kim was knocked down hard and the fight was stopped. Minutes later, he collapsed from a massive brain hemorrhage, fell into a coma, and died 4 days later at age 27. Then, just a couple months later, in early 1983, Kim's mother died by suicide after traveling to the US and struggling with her son's death. Just a few months after that, referee Richard Green also took his own life after reportedly falling into severe depression, overwhelmed by guilt and public blame for not stopping the fight sooner. The bout became one of the darkest moments in boxing history and directly led to major safety reforms and the elimination of 15-round title fights. In 1977, unemployed Indiana man Tony Karitzis kidnapped mortgage banker Richard Hall after blaming him for the foreclosure of his home. Tony strapped a sawed-off shotgun to Richard's neck, rigged with a dead man trigger so any sudden movement could fire it, and held him hostage inside the Meridian Mortgage Company for nearly 3 days. During the standoff, Richard was forced to walk outside in public and even stand through a live press conference with the gun still pressed against his neck. With negotiations failing and Richard's life constantly at risk, police ended the siege by shooting Tony through a window, killing him instantly as Richard survived unharmed. On Christmas Eve in 2008, 45-year-old Bruce Jeffrey Pardo arrived at his ex-wife's house in California wearing a Santa Claus suit and carrying multiple firearms. When the front door was opened by an 8-year-old girl, he shot her in the face before opening fire at a crowded family Christmas party. Bruce then unleashed a homemade fuel dispensing device hidden inside a wrapped present, igniting a massive fire that trapped victims inside as the house burned. 9 people were killed, some by gunfire, and others burned so badly that it took investigators several days to identify them. The fire burned so intensely that parts of Bruce's Santa suit melted onto his skin, forcing him to flee while still on fire. He later drove to his brother's house, where he turned the gun on himself. Investigators later determined the attack was driven by rage over a recent divorce, mounting financial pressure after losing his job, and a bitter custody dispute, with Bruce specifically targeting his ex-wife and her family. Police discovered that he'd spent months preparing, stockpiling weapons, booby-trapping vehicles with explosives, and compiling a list of additional targets including his ex-wife's divorce attorney, making the attack one of the most disturbing holiday massacres in U.S. history. Here's a photo of Magda Goebbels with her 6 children, taken sometime before all 6 would be murdered by their own parents as Nazi Germany collapsed. Their father, Joseph Goebbels, wasn't just a high-ranking Nazi, but the architect of the regime's propaganda machine, a man responsible for saturating Germany with anti-Semitic hatred, glorifying mass murder, justifying the Holocaust, and convincing millions that extermination and total war were moral duties. He publicly called for the annihilation of Jews, celebrated civilian deaths, and demanded Germans to fight to extinction rather than surrender, even as cities burned and children starved. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin in May of 1945, Goebbels remained fanatically loyal to Hitler, retreating with his family into the Führer bunker. There, Magda decided that her children could not live in a world without Nazism, poisoning each of them with cyanide as they slept. Afterward, Joseph and Magda reportedly took their own lives as Berlin fell and the Third Reich collapsed around them. Comedy legend Artie Lang survived one of the most self-destructive spirals in modern celebrity. In January of 2010, after years of severe heroin addiction, he stabbed himself multiple times in the abdomen inside his Hoboken apartment, collapsing from internal bleeding and barely surviving emergency surgery. His addiction later led to overdoses, constant arrests, homelessness, and the collapse of his nasal septum as a result of long-term cocaine abuse, permanently disfiguring his face. Thankfully, in recent years, Lang has said he's sober, lives mostly out of the spotlight, and prioritizes stability and health over returning to fame. In 2007, Shelley Miscavige, the wife of Scientology leader David Miscavige, and once one of the organization's most powerful figures, attended her father's funeral and then completely vanished from public view. She's not been seen, photographed, or heard from publicly ever since. In 2013, actress and Scientology defector Leah Remini filed a missing persons report, prompting the LAPD to state they had located Shelley and confirmed she was alive and safe, though no evidence, images, or details were released, and no independent verification has ever occurred. Former Scientology members allege she was removed from leadership and confined to a secret church facility due to internal conflicts with David, claims which the organization vehemently denies, leaving her disappearance unresolved nearly 2 decades later. Real estate agent Todd Kohlhepp became known as the Amazon Review Killer after investigators uncovered sarcastic product reviews he had posted that referenced his real crimes. For years, he joked about using knives, chains, and shovels while remaining unidentified. In 2016, police traced the disappearance of Kayla Brown to his rural South Carolina property, where she was found alive, chained inside a shipping container after Kohlhepp had already murdered her boyfriend. A search of the land revealed multiple buried bodies, and Kohlhepp later confessed to killing 7 people between 2003 and 2016, including 4 victims in a Long Cold motorcycle shop massacre. Kim Stanger is a criminal law researcher in Ohio who lives with an extremely rare neurological condition that leaves her with no sense of touch, pain, or temperature. Her peripheral nerves don't transmit any sensory signals, meaning she cannot feel injuries, burns, or pressure on her body. Doctors have described her as the only living person documented with a complete loss of somatosensation at this level. As a result, Stanger must visually monitor her body at all times to avoid unknowingly injuring herself, as even severe wounds or extreme temperatures provide no physical warning. On June 5, 1986, 24-year-old New York City model Marla Hanson was asked by her landlord Stephen Roth to meet outside a Manhattan bar to collect an $850 security deposit he owed her. As they walked away, Hanson was ambushed by 2 men Roth had hired. One attacker restrained her head while the other slashed her face with razor blades, carving deep wounds across her cheeks as Roth stood by and watched. The attack required more than 150 stitches, leaving her with permanent disfigurement that effectively ended her modeling career. Hanson survived after extensive reconstructive surgery, and investigators later determined that Roth had ordered the attack after she rejected his romantic advances. He and the 2 attackers were convicted and sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Hanson said the trauma continued in court, where a defense attorney subjected her to a vicious and humiliating cross-examination, attacking her credibility, accusing her of manipulating men, and suggested she had falsely identified her attackers due to her being racist, an experience she described as worse than the physical attack itself. This was the horrifying moment a young child was nearly killed by her bus driver when she became trapped after her backpack was caught in the closing door of a Kentucky school bus as she was getting off. The driver then pulled away without noticing, dragging the child alongside the moving bus for hundreds of feet. Luckily, honking bystanders eventually caught the bus driver's attention and she was forced to come to an abrupt stop. The girl suffered serious physical injuries including nerve damage, requiring nearly a dozen surgeries and skin grafts, along with lasting psychological trauma. Court filings noted that she was a special needs student and argued that the bus route, supervision, and safety procedures in place were not appropriate for her needs. The bus driver was removed from duty and later fired, and the school district acknowledged failures in safety oversight. Years later, the child, publicly identified as Allie Rednauer, is back on her feet but continues to deal with ongoing physical and emotional effects and continued medical care. The case ultimately ended with a nearly $5 million settlement, and Allie and her family have since spoken out, pushing for mandatory school bus safety upgrades and warning that without changes, another child could be seriously injured or killed in the same way. This was the moment when British comedian Tommy Cooper suddenly collapsed mid-performance on live television, and millions of paramedics were finally called. He was eventually pronounced dead shortly after arriving at Westminster Hospital, as the audience had been completely unaware that they were laughing at a man who was going through his agonizing final moments. This was one of the last known photos taken of rapper XXXTentacion, moments before he was fatally shot during a robbery outside a Florida motorcycle dealership in June of 2018. Investigators determined it was not a targeted hit job, but a robbery gone wrong after suspects spotted his luxury vehicle and expensive Louis Vuitton bag. Released surveillance footage showed 2 gunmen approaching his car, demanding the bag and opening fire when he resisted. The 20-year-old artist, born Jose Onfroy, was shot multiple times at close range and died shortly after at a nearby hospital. In 2023, 3 men were convicted of his first-degree murder and armed robbery. Beatrice Flamini spent 500 days completely alone inside a cave nearly 230 feet underground, cut off from sunlight, clocks, and all human contact as part of an experiment on extreme isolation. She entered the cave in November of 2021 and did not emerge until April of 2023, with no communication with the outside world during that time. Scientists monitoring her remotely had found that her circadian rhythm had completely collapsed, with severe sleep disruption, memory lapses, and slowed cognition developing over time. Flamini later described moments of mental detachment and sensory distortion, and when she finally resurfaced, she genuinely believed she'd only been underground for about 160 days, illustrating how prolonged isolation can fundamentally fracture the brain's sense of time and reality. This was the moment when a routine day on the slope suddenly spiraled into chaos, when a chairlift at Georgia's Gadori Ski Resort malfunctioned and began racing backward down the mountain. The lift reversed at high speed, smashing chairs together at the bottom terminal and violently throwing riders to the ground, while others were forced to jump to avoid being crushed by swinging metal seats. Screams erupted as people piled at the base of the lift, with some narrowly missing being struck by flying chairs and bodies. At least 8 people were seriously injured, including tourists from several countries, with reported injuries ranging from broken limbs to head and spinal trauma. Investigators later concluded the rollback was triggered by an electrical failure, which was only worsened by operator error after emergency procedures were not properly followed. In the aftermath, the lift operator was suspended and resort managers were forced to resign. Criminal and civil investigations later followed, examining how a system designed to keep riders safe turned into a death trap within seconds. In February of 2025, 22-year-old Daniel Waterman was left comatose after a violent interstate crash in Florida, leaving him with severe head and spinal injuries. After briefly regaining consciousness months later, he told investigators the crash was intentional, alleging that his pregnant girlfriend, 24-year-old Leah Mumby, deliberately drove the car into a tree during an argument, accelerating as he tried to escape and telling him, "I don't care what happens, you'll get what you deserve." Mumby initially said she did not remember what happened before the crash. Waterby died from his injuries in October of 2025, and prosecutors later upgraded her charges to vehicular homicide. In 1962, the United States detonated a nuclear warhead in space during the Starfish Prime test, exploding it about 250 miles above Earth. The blast was far more destructive than expected, knocking out or damaging multiple satellites, creating artificial radiation belts that lingered for years, and causing electrical failures as far away as Hawaii. The test proved that nuclear explosions in space were unpredictable and capable of long-term damage to both technology and Earth's near-space environment, effectively ending any further attempts once scientists realized the harm could not be controlled. Austin Chumley Russell is best known as the laid-back fan favorite on Pawn Stars, but his life briefly veered off course in 2016 when police raided his Las Vegas home during a sexual assault investigation. The SA allegations were later dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the search uncovered a loaded firearm along with methamphetamine, marijuana, and Xanax. Chum was arrested and later pleaded guilty to a felony weapons charge and a misdemeanor drug charge, receiving probation, counseling, and rehab instead of prison time. He later cleaned up his life, lost 150 pounds, stayed on the show, and has spoken openly about focusing on his health and sobriety afterward. In 2010, an undercover journalist working for the dissident outlet Asia Press smuggled out rare footage from North Korea showing a severely malnourished 23-year-old homeless woman who said she survived by eating grass. Her voice was so weak that the reporter couldn't clearly record her name, and her identity has never been verified. Months later, local contacts reported she was found dead in a nearby cornfield, believed to have collapsed from starvation while desperately trying to eat raw corn. North Korea's state media never acknowledged the footage, but defectors reported heightened surveillance and crackdowns in the area afterward, with anyone suspected of leaking information facing severe punishment. This was the moment when a hang gliding instructor realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. In November of 2018 in Switzerland, American tourist Chris Gursky had just taken off on a tandem hang gliding flight when he and the instructor immediately noticed that Gursky was not attached to the safety harness at all. The instructor immediately attempted an emergency stop, but strong winds instead lifted the glider higher into the air, sending them soaring hundreds of feet above the ground. With no safety line and no way to land immediately, Gursky was left dangling with nothing securing him to the aircraft. He was forced to cling to the metal frame with his hands while also desperately gripping the instructor to avoid falling. For more than 2 minutes, Gursky held on for dear life as his arms visibly shook and his grip weakened, fully aware that giving in to the pain would mean certain death. The entire ordeal was captured on video as the instructor desperately fought the wind and steered toward an emergency landing. When they finally reached the ground, Gursky collapsed in pain and was later diagnosed with a fractured wrist and torn bicep from hanging on so tightly. Authorities ruled the accident a serious safety failure, fining the instructor and suspending his license, while the footage became a chilling reminder of how one small misstep turned a fun recreational flight into a life-threatening nightmare.
Somebody screamed, "Call the police," and I said, "No!" And I just fired the gun, and this big noise went off, and then I grabbed the phone and got the hell out of there. But I wasn't even in that room. I mean, it just was an explosion. Just, I moved, they moved, the gun went off, and it was like, ah! And it was that fast.
That was Betty Broderick on the witness stand, describing how she shot her ex-husband and his new wife as they slept. On November 5th, 1989, the 41-year-old broke into the San Diego home of renowned attorney Dan Broderick and fatally shot him and his wife Linda Colkenna in their bed before turning herself in the next morning. The killings followed a bitter years-long divorce, marked by accusations of infidelity, emotional abuse, and financial control. Betty had supported Dan through medical and law school, only to be discarded for his much younger assistant, who later became his wife. As the marriage unraveled, her behavior escalated, including vandalizing his home, ramming her car into his front door, and multiple psychiatric hospitalizations. Although Betty claimed she only meant to confront the couple, prosecutors played recorded calls in which she said she wished Dan would just die. She was ultimately convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years to life. This was the moment a normal day at a busy restaurant nearly turned into a child abduction. Without warning, a man later identified as Nassim Slamang vaulted over a railing and grabbed a young girl by the neck as she sat with her family, attempting to pull her away in front of stunned onlookers. But before he could escape, restaurant owner Dishal Suku, a trained jiu-jitsu black belt, rushed in, tackled the suspect to the ground, and restrained him until police arrived. Slamang was arrested and later prosecuted for the attempted kidnapping, while the family was left shaken by how close the child came to vanishing within seconds. This is exactly why you should always test the waters before swimming in the streets of Thailand after a massive flood. Severe flooding hit Thailand in November of 2025 after days of heavy rain, with water rising more than 20 feet in some areas and swallowing entire neighborhoods within hours. The floods came so fast that many residents were trapped without food for days, and more than 100 people were reported killed across the region. As water displaced wildlife and habitats, massive snakes, including pythons, were seen swimming through streets and entering homes seeking higher ground alongside terrified residents. While on his way to Toronto to film the second season of Gen V in March of 2024, actor Chance Perdomo tragically died in a single-vehicle motorcycle crash at just 27 years old. Authorities confirmed no other vehicles were involved, but never released the exact location, cause of the crash, weather condition, or road details, leaving the true circumstances unknown. Because he died alone, there were no public witnesses and no full incident report, sparking endless speculation among fans. Eerily, just days before the accident, he posted a photo of his motorcycle on Instagram with the ominous caption, "The final calm before the storm." His death impacted Gen V so heavily that production was postponed, and instead of recasting his character, the writers rewrote the entire season around his absence, a rare move that shows just how important and irreplaceable he was as an actor. In 1996, a stray mother cat in New York City became famous for performing one of the most heroic acts in animal rescue history. When the abandoned garage she and her newborn kittens were living in caught fire, she ran through the flames 5 separate times, carrying each kitten out one by one. By the time she saved the last one, her eyes were blistered shut, her ears and paws were burned, and her fur was scorched. But she touched each kitten with her nose to make sure they were all alive before collapsing unconscious. Nicknamed Scarlet, she later recovered at a veterinary hospital and was reunited with her kittens, all of whom survived. The story went viral worldwide, and the mother cat and all 5 of her babies were eventually adopted into loving homes. David Parker Ray wasn't just a serial killer. He did things to women so horrific that the FBI agents who investigated him needed therapy. In Elephant Butte, New Mexico, he constructed a custom soundproof trailer he called the Toy Box, filled with whips, chains, saws, medical equipment, video cameras, and even a mechanical torture device he built himself. When victims woke up strapped to a gynecologist table, he played a 20-minute audio tape calmly explaining how he was going to rape, torture, and break them over the next several days.
Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances. Now, you are obviously here against your will. Totally helpless. Don't know where you're at. Don't know what's going to happen to you. You're very scared or very pissed off. I'm sure that you've already tried to get your wrists and ankles loose. No, you can't. Now you're just waiting to see what's going to happen next. You probably think you're going to be raped, and you're f***ing sure right about that.
Ray's girlfriend and even his own daughter helped him kidnap women, and after days of torture, he would drug them with amnesia-inducing sedatives and dump them in the desert so disoriented they couldn't report what happened. Investigators later found journals detailing 40 years of abuse and believe he murdered up to 60 women, but not a single body has ever been found. Ray was only caught in 1999 when a victim escaped naked with a metal dog collar still around her neck, leading police to the toy box, a torture chamber so sadistic that FBI agents who entered it required extensive therapy. But despite the unimaginable horror, Ray was never convicted of murder, dying of a heart attack in 2002 and taking his most awful secrets to his grave. In one of the dumbest crimes in history, an Arizona man who worked for UPS stole a diamond worth $160,000, then traded it for some weed. Instead of selling it or hiding it, he handed the massive gemstone to his dealer for a $20 bag of marijuana. The dealer, shocked by how valuable it looked, brought it to a jewelry store to get it appraised, and the person behind the counter instantly recognized it as stolen. Police were called, and within days, both the thief and the dealer were arrested. In the end, the man didn't just waste a life-changing fortune, he basically turned himself in for the price of a dub. On the other hand, in 1968 Japan, a man pulled off one of the most brilliant heists in history without the use of a single weapon. Disguised as a motorcycle cop, he pulled over a bank vehicle carrying over $10 million in cash and claimed it was rigged to explode. To make it believable, he lit a flare underneath the car and yelled for the employees to run. They bolted in fear as he calmly got in, drove off with all the cash, and vanished. Despite the largest manhunt Japan had ever seen, interviewing over 100,000 people, neither the thief nor the money has ever been found. In 2022, 39-year-old Stephen Dierkes was working at Caterpillar's foundry in Illinois when he suddenly slipped and fell into a large vat of molten iron heated to 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. The human body has zero chance at that temperature as he was vaporized instantly. A coworker said part of his body was still on the platform while the rest of it melted like candle wax. OSHA later found several severe safety violations, but nothing could undo one of the most horrific workplace deaths in history. Kazuko Fukuda, dubbed the Woman of Seven Faces, strangled a coworker in 1982 and disappeared, launching one of Japan's longest manhunts in history. But instead of hiding, she reinvented herself over and over, using fake identities, constant moves, and even plastic surgery to change her face. She stayed free for nearly 15 years, long enough that Japan's statute of limitations on murder was about to expire. But just months before time ran out, a diner owner recognized her from a TV show, and police confirmed her identity using fingerprints on a beer bottle. She was finally sentenced to life in 1999, but died in prison just 6 years later. While preparing for his Joker role in Suicide Squad, Jared Leto tried so hard to be edgy that he terrified his own castmates. He reportedly mailed them a dead pig, bullets, pornographic objects, and even a live rat. Some actors also claimed he sent used condoms, though Leto denied this, but multiple sources insist the gifts were so revolting that people genuinely felt unsafe around him. Despite all of his extreme method acting, most of Leto's scenes didn't even make the final movie. And when it finally came out, fans and critics agreed his Joker was one of the worst interpretations ever put on screen. In 1937, 20-year-old Patricia Douglas was hired for what she thought was a film job, only to be taken to a booze-filled MGM party where she was forced to drink and brutally raped by a salesman inside a car. Instead of taking hush money, she did the unthinkable for the era. She filed a lawsuit against MGM, publicly accusing the studio of covering up the crime. But she would find out the hard way that MGM was untouchable. They paid off witnesses, falsified medical records, smeared her as a drunken prostitute, stalked her, and blacklisted her from Hollywood. Hollywood. The case was dismissed, the press mocked her, and her life was completely destroyed. Patricia vanished from the public eye, and Hollywood buried her story for nearly 70 years, until the truth was finally uncovered after she died in 2003. Child actor Kyle Massey, who played Corey Baxter in That's So Raven and Corey in the House, was once a family-friendly icon. But in 2019, a 13-year-old girl and her mother filed a lawsuit accusing Massey of sending her explicit photos, videos, and sexual messages. The girl had met Massey years earlier when she was just 4, after her mother introduced them on a set. According to the lawsuit, Massey later reconnected with her and promised to help launch her acting career. But 2 years later, prosecutors in Washington state charged Massey with immoral communication with a minor, after investigators found that he allegedly sent nude photos and videos to the same underage girl through Snapchat. Kyle never showed up to his court date, and a warrant was issued for his arrest, but his lawyers later claimed he'd never been properly served. While Massey denied all allegations, the case effectively ended his acting career, leaving fans stunned that the goofy kid from Disney could end up being accused of something so disturbing. As of now, no conviction has been publicly reported, and the legal proceedings have faded quietly from headlines, but the case still remains a strange, unsettling fall from fame for one of Disney's once brightest faces. Joey Gatos Jr., the child actor who played Zach Mooneyham in School of Rock, was arrested in Florida in 2019 after allegedly stealing multiple guitars and amplifiers from local music stores. Authorities said he'd enter shops, test out pricey instruments like a professional, then simply walk out the door with them before pawning them off for quick cash. The spree reportedly lasted several weeks before he was caught, and police suggested the thefts were connected to struggles with substance abuse. Once celebrated for his guitar skills on screen, Gatos' real-life downfall was a far cry from the rock star dream that made him famous. In 1926, jazz legend Fats Waller was leaving a Chicago nightclub when 4 armed men suddenly grabbed him, threw him into a car, and drove off. Initially terrified, Waller soon realized he wasn't being robbed. He was being delivered as a surprise birthday gift to none other than mob boss Al Capone. Forced to play piano at Capone's private party, Waller ended up performing for 3 straight days, while dozens of gangsters cheered, drank, and shoved cash into his pockets. When it was finally all over, Waller stumbled out of the mansion completely drunk, covered in sweat, and stuffed with thousands of dollars in tips. Despite the bizarre ordeal, Waller reportedly laughed it off afterwards, saying it was the best paying gig he ever had by far.